Welcome, church. This is the kickoff video for section 3 of our Acts study. We have up until now been moving through the first 7 chapters of this book of Acts and seeing how Jesus, despite having ascended to the Father, is building his church. Things have been in these first 7 chapters very much centered around Jerusalem, but now this week we're going to move through a massive transition because persecution has come down in the church and it has just scattered it all over the local area and beyond. It's like one of those big glass bowls that you or your children let fall on the ground and it just goes poof, sending shards in every direction. So the church scrambles and takes that gospel with them. And so we're going to see how this Jewish community, now in chapters 8 through 12, which is where we're at now in this week, we're going to see how they move through that period of transition. In chapter 15, which is also part of this section, we're going to see how they react to this transition. And this is going to prepare the way for massive explosion of growth in the second half of the book. Alright, so since we're doing this, looking at this main thing of Jesus carrying out his work, building his church, we're also getting like a front row seat, observing what this church is really like. Now, up until now, we've been seeing how they've had power that is not human power from above. We've seen how they are willing to face whatever cost they're required to make. And now this week, we want to focus in this third section on how they are a church that is made up of people from all over the world, every different cultural and social background, and how they are one new community. They are united. Okay, since this is a kickoff video, I want to just look through these chapters and plot out these 2 themes for you. So, Luke leads us through two major transitions. Okay, so here we are showing you the chapters. We've covered the beginning, the getting going, and the getting ready and going. Last week we covered a lot of the challenges that were coming against the church, and now we lead into chapters 9 through 12 and chapter 15. Luke leads us in these chapters through 2 major transitions. A transition of people group and a transition of kind of ministry center. He follows the story of some Greek-speaking Jews. These have been introduced to us back in our previous section in chapter 6. We have Stephen, who we mentioned last time. He has confronted the Pharisees on their false doctrine, on their false understanding of God's salvation, and he has stirred up the hornet's nest. There is a persecution that comes down in the church led by this guy, Saul. And this persecution drives Philip, another one of these Greek-speaking Jews, out of Jerusalem, and actually he ends up in Samaria, a different people group. He preaches to them. The Spirit comes in a very official, clear way, indicating that another people group have been added to the church. And so that's where we begin really in chapter 8, this section. In chapter 9, we have the story of this persecutor, this leader of the persecution against the church, Paul, or then known Saul. He is on his way to Damascus and Jesus intercepts him and sends him on into Damascus, however on a totally different mission. You get to see his total turnaround and how the shock waves that begin as he begins to minister, and instead of persecuting the church, suffering for his Savior. And this is only going to get more. This transition of people group comes to its completion in chapter 10 and 11, where we see the story flips back to Peter, who is positioned in Joppa and prepared to go to the Gentiles. He ends up in Cornelius' house. He preaches the gospel. The Spirit again comes in a very obvious way to say that there is another people group who have been added to the church. Jerusalem accepts this. The story is more or less repeated in chapter 11, but repetition is important. Repetition is one of those ways that the writer can sort of highlight something. It's a literary device to say, look at this is important. And so here we go. Transition 1, people group. Now we've went from a totally Hebrew, mono-ethnic, to a group of people that include all nations on the earth. Secondly, chapter 12 show the transition of ministry center. We have been very much centered around Jerusalem, and we're going to move to being centered in Antioch after these chapters. Luke gives us a good few little stories. Persecution rises in Jerusalem. Things get really tough. James is killed. Peter's arrested. But then we also see then Antioch, Christians there are beginning to get more renowned, they're getting well known, identified as one people group, and they start to minister to stricken Jerusalem. There's a famine there, and so you can just see Luke shifting our attention away from Jerusalem to Antioch, to this new energy, this freedom that they have, and think about the possibilities that could start from this church. I think that's what he wants us to see. There is, by the way, before we talk about chapter 15, about 14 years from when Paul goes to Jerusalem after his conversion to when he goes back again in chapter 15 for the council. So we jump ahead then to chapter 15. This is the council in Jerusalem. I'm only going to mention it because we'll deal with it in more detail in later on in the video, because it is our focus passage. But essentially this is where they make that official declaration that because of the grace of God, there should be one church, that there is unity. There is, which I haven't noticed here, one further transition. It is a transition of leadership. I've been very much hearing from Peter, and by the end of this, Paul is going to be the guy that Luke follows. So just one little extra transition for you for free. Okay, I want to just draw your attention again to this right-hand side where we're plotting how Jesus is building his church. Here we've just mentioned those three areas: Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the world, all the nations. What has been impressive to me is how Jesus has brought this about. Now, he said he's going to build his church, and then he even tells in chapter 1 the disciples to go into these areas. But just think of all the things in these chapters that have been involved in getting those events to where their completion. Persecution, you have individual efforts on different people, you have visions and angels and the spirits directing. All this has come together as Jesus' work of building his church, and it's wonderful to see really how he truly is reigning. To complete the overview of the chapters, let me highlight on the map Jesus' activity of building his church. Now, he gave us three boundaries, kind of Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and then out to the end of the world. Here is my map of the Eastern Mediterranean, a new one for us, but this is where we're going to be focusing on for the next couple of sections. Little figure of Jesus here, possibly not accurate. Here's the Mediterranean. Here's Cyprus, Crete. You see Palestine here, up over Turkey, modern day Turkey, over to Greece. Now, here's Jerusalem. This is where we've been centered. And Jerusalem gets filled, and then through persecution, the people are moving out. The disciples have to run. And so they take the message, and you can see also when Peter was ministering to this area of Judea. Just north of Judea is Samaria, south of where Galilee would be. And so they're moving out of Jerusalem, Judea. Next further out is Samaria. And then, of course, the end of the world and the nations and further. And this is where we're going to see events happening in the next sections. So the other thing that we want to say is here's Antioch. We move from Jerusalem up to Antioch is the new center. In the events of chapter 9, we see Paul. He is moving out of Jerusalem, fired up, moves probably out of Jerusalem, crosses the Jordan to avoid Samaria, and then moves possibly up this road in this direction towards Damascus, which is over here off the side of our map. And this is where he's intercepted by Jesus. Now, Jesus also speaks to Ananias and tells him, go tell Paul that you're going to take my message to the kings, to Gentiles, and to the children of Israel. And that gives us three more kind of targets for the second half of the book. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground this week, 6 chapters, and although you can take this in your own time and read a little bit each day over these 2 weeks, what happens if you want to sit down with a group of people, like a life group, or even with your kids in the evening, and look directly at one passage? 6 chapters is too much, right? And so for this reason, we want to suggest that you turn to the focus passage. The focus passage contains really the central teaching about this main point of unity, as it has done in each of the previous sections. It'll be small enough for you to go through verse by verse if you want, or to dig a little bit more deeper. Or even when it comes to me and Tommy, just repeat. You'll find the focus text this week, starting from chapter 14, verse 27, moving through to chapter 15, verse 11. And it's really the story of the 2 cities. Antioch's over here. Jerusalem's higher, that's where you're going down to Antioch. A question comes up over circumcision of all things. And these guys take a little trek. Paul and Barnabas and a few others take a trek up to Jerusalem. Quite a trek, actually. They get an answer for it. Now, on a first glance, maybe you'd be wondering, why is this so important? I mean, this seems like a theological detail, one of these debates in between Christians. There's such an emphasis in our study. I mean, isn't these councils, like, they don't really seem to be big moments in history? Well, they are. But besides the point, the real reason why we're doing this, making this an important text for us, is because for Luke it was an important text, and he wants us to see that. He's put it right at the very middle of his book. You could say like a mountain, everything before it has been leading up to this point, and everything after will be responding to it in some way. And so this question of circumcision is really at the very summit. I thought I would take this time as I introduce the focus passage, not to so much talk about the content of the text, that's for you, but to look at this, why is this such an important topic? Delve a little bit more into kind of the foundation or the background. Well, here we have in Antioch, loads of different types of Christians. You have people from all over the world, different social classes, Jews and Gentiles, men and women. You have the rich, the poor, the aristocrats, the slaves, all sorts of different people, and they've all been saved, they've all come to know God, and they've all come together in one church. So much so that when the other Antioch people look at them, they don't identify them with who they were. If they see a Jew, they don't think, oh, there's a Jew who also does these Christian things, or there's a Roman soldier, kind of has something to do with this new way. What people are doing how they are identifying this group of people, when they look at them, they're identifying them as all like Christ. They are all somehow one. They have a common identity. And this all happens back in chapter 11. It's where Christians were first called Christians there in Antioch. That there is this one identity from all this really diverse group of people, all have this unity. And this is the main point. Salvation leads to unity. That's what really is happening. Yes, this text was started all about this question of circumcision, but they pretty much immediately dive down to the foundation of the point of salvation. And you'll see that in the dialogues in this passage. And the thing is, when you have salvation by the grace of God, you have unity. And that's what this little diagram is meant to say. Grace, like a foundation that holds us up, that stops us falling into the pit, has brought together all this group of people. Now, that's until these guys come down from Jerusalem. They're teaching that not only do you need the grace of God, but then you also need to follow the law. You need to do works. You need to be circumcised. And so you need grace plus works. Essentially what they were saying there is grace isn't enough. Like a foundation that is failing, it's not enough. I mean, the problem with this is that salvation is when you depend upon God's work alone. That's the teaching of the Bible. And when you add something to it, you then are no longer depending on God's work alone. And so what they're teaching is a gospel that has no salvation, that will not be accompanied by the work of God. Let's pause for a second and let me just say something on a side note. The law of Moses is not a bad thing. And we're not talking about here whether or not Christians should steal or not, all these things that are somehow mentioned in the law. What we're talking about here is the basis on which you are accepted with God. What is the basis of the foundation? So, answer this question or complete this statement. I am accepted by God, I have peace with God because. Is it grace, God's grace, or is it grace plus my good efforts? That's the question. And these guys were saying, you need grace plus your good efforts at following the law. And as I say, they remove salvation with this because this is a false teaching. And what actually it ends up doing, because you remove the foundation, the salvation, you bring division. You remove also the unity. They bring division. And we've seen this actually. If you study or even look briefly at Galatians 2, it's talking about the same time. Peter, it says, at some point has made his way down to Antioch, and he is there fellowshipping with the Gentiles as if they were brothers all together. And then Suddenly comes these guys down from Jerusalem, and Peter withdraws. He cuts off fellowship with the Gentiles. He treats them as something different. These guys, let's say the Judaizers, are saying to the others, you don't have it all. You need to come over here. You need to do grace plus works. And it brings division. And you could have had here a split in the church right near the beginning. A split that would have echoed down the ages. And then maybe more splits where you have different churches for different people groups and people and different styles of worship or whatever. You can see the danger here. Plus the danger that obviously it's not the gospel. You are hiding, obscuring that light through which people can see and be saved. And so it all came down through this little issue of circumcision. Would it slip in unopposed? Would there be people alert? Well, thankfully, Paul and Barnabas were alert. They created a stir, they opposed these guys, and then they took it up to Jerusalem. And even in how they did that, they showed that the unity of the church was important for them. And they also showed that the authority of the apostles was something that was important to the church. If we take a step back, this was all new. If you were a Jew, you were used to following the law of Moses, right? And the church has been more or less all Jews up to this point. The Jews had had the law. God had given the law. Aren't we to be obedient to God? And so they had taken into their new life of the church. And now suddenly comes in contact with people very different, the Gentiles. And maybe you've even experienced that if you've come to Cologne and met people from all over the world. They don't do things like my home church does it. Here's the thing. It was a big challenge for the Jews. Did they really, or for the church in general, did they understand really the basis on which they had a relationship with God and a relationship with one another? Were they going to continue to have faith, depend upon grace, God alone, God's work alone? Were they going to even continue to proclaim that message through which people could be saved? Or were they going to allow it to be obscured in this new weird teaching? And even finally, if you think about these poor Gentiles who'd been taught one message and had this joy of the fellowship and the unity of the body, were they now going to be cut off, treated like second-hand Christians, or even forced to start to follow the law, to be culturally Jewish? Well, I will let you in your study find out. How did the apostles approach this? How did they argue? I also want you to say that keep an eye as we're this week studying and trying to understand the unity and the basis by which we have unity. Think about next week. Also, bear in mind that we will be starting to think about how we as a church, IBC Cologne, treat one another, accept one another, all sorts of different people. We have almost an Antioch moment opportunity in front of us. And do we even get grace? Or is there more to be understood and accepted and enjoyed? Well, I wish you a wonderful study this week, and we will see each other on Sunday.